So thank you so much, for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm really happy to see so many people turn out. I'm Adam, as you may see from the Zoom call, some of you may know, and I'm currently a first-year MSc student at Bocconi University in Italy. And today I'd like to talk to you about some work that I carried out during my bachelor's degree, actually, at Warwick, on the topic of do unhappy citizens vote for populism? Now, this is the first time that I actually presented in public, hence any kind of feedback, criticism, comments are more than welcome. And I myself am quite new to well-being research, so I'm really thankful for this platform. To give you a brief overview about what I will talk about today, this evening or this morning, wherever you are in the world. First of all, I'll give you a brief background and some motivation of my work, then talk about what we understand as the economics of populism, so supply and demand, following which I discuss the data, the methodology, and the empirical results. And towards the end, if I have some time, I mention my own caveats of the work and some robustness checks, but if not, then I also leave that for the Q&A. So as for the background, so what do we know or what do we think we know about populism? History 101, the term itself originates from the late 19th century when a coalition of farmers, workers, and miners in the US rallied against the gold standard and the Northeastern banking and finance establishment. Of course, just because the term was formulated then doesn't mean that there weren't any populist movements before. Today, it's more of a broad range of movements. In Europe, we have anti-Euro, anti-immigration. In the US, we just had Donald Trump, and hopefully that's gone for good. In Latin America, we have Chavez, etc. Although at first sight, these movements may seem quite different, they may, or it may be argued that they have a common denominator, and that's the anti-establishment orientation, a claim to speak for the people and against the elites, oppose liberal economics, oppose globalization, and tend towards what one may call dictatorial rule. This is a brief slide, a chart from The Economist. So it's the past more or less 10 years, missing out on the last two. And it selects a few populist parties across Europe. You might have seen it. One thing that I would like you to carry out from here is that, first of all, these parties have ups and downs in support, if you believe in national polls, that is. And secondly, that some are around 50%. So Fidesz in Hungary, they have a majority, whereas others, for example, the five-star movement in my own backyard here in Italy is at 30, and some were created and then died off like UKIP. And what are the common explanations? So here I just cite some papers. I don't really want to go into what every single paper talks about. And they're not only papers on populism, but they're also papers on anti-incumbent voting. So I can briefly group, given time constraints, the literature into three boxes. And the first one being the economic explanations. So for example, unemployment shocks, and the likes, or income shocks, which shift you towards populist parties and that kind of support. Here, if you want to read one paper following the presentation, I would suggest Guizzo et al. 2017. There have been about 3 or 4 versions already, so you might want to find more updated work on it. Then in the cultural sense, the explanations involve some parts of society that are forgotten or lost as we proceed to more liberal values, for example, and also attitudes such as anti-immigration, trust, and these kind of things. And then we have the psychological explanations, and these may involve, let's say, collective narcissism, betrayal aversion, and these kind of theories, and that's where my work fits in as well. So my work more broadly is on the demand side of populism. Now, what do we understand as the demand side? We understand voting for populist parties. It may be interesting as well to try to explain why these parties appear in the first place and what are the preconditions. However, that goes a little bit beyond the scope of my work. Just to keep in mind that if you have a market, the most simple thing may be demand and supply, and one can't exist without the other. So I've been talking about populism for the past 4 minutes, but what really does this term mean? So at the University of Warwick, we have the Work Economics Summit, and Andres Velasco from the LSE was presenting on populism across the world. And one of the quotes which stuck to me whilst I was writing my thesis was, that populism is like pornography. When you see it, you know it. Of course, this in reference to the famous US Supreme Court decision in the 1964, I believe, or so. However, for empirical analysis and for quite clear reasons, that's not enough. So a more academic definition, it may involve Mode from 2004, who defines populism as an ideology arguing a chasm between two homogeneous groups, the people and the corrupt elite. So its features include anti-establishment focus, negligence of long-term consequences of policy, and again, the same aforementioned propensity towards authoritarianism. So how may one even measure that? So my paper operationalized the term in two ways, using two distinct classifications. And here there are. The first one is by Van Kessel from 2015, and it's based on his book, Populist Parties in Europe, Agents of Discontent. This is quite a common measure. It's been used previously. And the second one that I use is based on Engelhardt and Norris from 2016. It's a paper, and they're probably one of the two leaders currently on the cultural backlash hypothesis of populist voting, in that they argue that cultural factors outweigh economic ones in predicting populist vote. So just for those of you who are interested in such kind of work, perhaps more recently, there has been a website that's set up. Here's just a screenshot from it. It's called The Populist, where a group of researchers from the University of Amsterdam, but not only, together with Van Kessel, Mode, etc., try to classify parties across Europe in a way of yes or not, yes populist, not populist. And there has also been a fourth approach by the Pew Research Center in the US, who just decide to combine, for example, different populist classifications, and they take three and they say, for example, when a party is present in two of the three classifications, we claim it to be a populist party. So how does this work in practice? So again, Van Kessel, sorry for the great amount of definitions, but just given that it's such a complex concept, I feel it's important to explain this. Van Kessel in 2015 proposed a definition of populist parties as those which consistently portray, so satisfy three conditions: portray the people as virtuous and homogeneous, advocate popular sovereignty, and define themselves against the political establishment. Now, how do you construct such measures? So Van Kessel used primary sources, for example, manifestos and speeches, and then handed them over to independent experts to decide on a party-by-party basis whether or not a party was populist according to them. And very importantly, perhaps for my work, is that they cover most European parties and all European countries that are relevant. And then we have the second classification, the Norris and Engelhardt one, and they rely on the Chapel Hill 2014 expert survey. I believe there might be a new expert survey from 4 years later. Why is it an expert survey? Perhaps the name itself has some kind of hint in that they literally survey experts. So around 220 experts being asked on the ideological positions of different parties. And then they rank those, again, they select a measure of a scale from the Chapel Hill expert survey and rank those scoring above 80 points on the 100-point scale as populist. So it's somewhat arbitrary. Moving forward, so in my paper and in my work, this may look somehow like this. You have the country a party is present in, you have the actual party, and then you have a column for both classifications, so Kessel and Engelhardt and Norris. Here they take the value of 1 if a party is populist according to a given classification, and 0 else. This is of course not complete, it's only one half of the index. If you want to see the other half, I'm more than happy to demonstrate it towards the end. The orientation of the parties as well, they tend to be either right, left wing, or center right, center left. This is based according to Engelhardt and Norris here, but I wouldn't over-focus on that right now. As for the data comes from the European Social Survey. It's quite a commonly used survey in Europe, at least for social science research. The data is individual level, as is my entire analysis, and it's collected every 2 years. Importantly, it involves a very wide selection of variables that are of much use when trying to control for attitudes, beliefs, and demographics of voters. One thing that I want to note is that over time, the number of countries in the ESS has increased. However, there have also been countries who've been present in some waves, not present in others, and present again, as well as not having all modules considered within that. So there's quite a bit of variability across, but overall, I think it's quite sensible and good quality data. There's a vast sample size, so that's around 240,000 individuals available for my analysis from a raw sample of around 360,000. And it's funded by the European Commission. You may find it online. It's publicly available as well. What are the relevant variables? So I examine European voters. So the dependent variable in my analysis is the populist dummy, as mentioned before, which takes the value 1 if a voter supported the populist party and 0 else. So how do I identify these kind of voters? For a voter to support a populist party, they have to first of all vote. And secondly, they have to vote for that party. So choose the party. It can be thought of as a two-stage level. So the voters themselves are identified by the question, the exact wording of which is as follows. Some people don't vote nowadays for one reason or another. Did you vote in the last, say, Italian national election in April 2020? And then the second question, which allows to identify populist voters and non-populist voters, is which party did you vote for in that election? As for the explanatory variables, they're perhaps a bit, well, two are standard and the third one's perhaps non-standard. Now, the standard ones would be life satisfaction, the wording of which is all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole nowadays? Probably known to most of you again, but it ranges from 0, extremely unsatisfied, to 10, extremely satisfied. Happiness, so I'm going to primarily talk about life satisfaction later on, given the high correlation with happiness, but I'm happy to present the other results as well during the Q&A or discussion following that. The happiness question is phrased as follows: taking all things together, how happy would you say you are? And 0 is extremely unhappy, 10 is extremely happy. Now, given the current COVID-19 pandemic, I thought it quite interesting to examine as well feelings and subjective general health. So how is your health in general? Would you say it is? And here, one thing to note is that the scale is reversed. So 1 is very good and 5 is very bad. So lower values are better as opposed to higher values on the scale. So moving forward, I'm sorry for this wordy slide, but I would only like you to focus on the red circle or oval. In the ESS data, around 74% of individuals claim to have voted, which are quite high turnout rates comparing to actual turnout rates, I suppose. From these 74%, we have around 9.9% individuals who decided to support a populist party, according to KESO, with 8.1% being the equivalent figure for the alternative classification. As for happiness and life satisfaction, well, generally Europeans tend to be quite happy with an average score of 7.31 across all the waves and satisfied with their lives. So 6.94, as well as feel that their health is quite good. As for the correlation between the different populist variables, so between the two measures in the ESS data, I note that it's around 61.45%. So when you just take the correlation between the two measures in ESS data, it's 61.45%. Quite high, but not perfect. So that may somehow undermine an objective definition of populist parties, but it's just something that I wanted to keep in mind throughout the presentation. As for the row patterns and row distributions, here again, I would like to focus on the three bottom charts. On the y-axis, you may see the probability of voting for a populist party. And on the x-axis, the level or the category of subjective well-being. So here you may see extremely unhappy individuals in the first bottom left chart. And they have around a 20% probability of voting for populist parties, whereas the happier ones tend to go even below 10%, so around 7%, and this is conditional on having voted in the election. I note a negative correlation, which is quite raw, of course, between the probability of supporting a populist party and an individual's well-being. That's all I want to keep in mind for now. Now, as for the econometric specification and the actual modeling, I assume a linear model estimated via OLS. The dependent variable is the populist dummy that I mentioned before, taking the value of 1 if someone voted populist, 0 not. The central coefficient, well, the most important coefficient is the rho coefficient on the relevant subjective well-being variable of interest. So I run a separate regression for every single subjective well-being measure considered. And I complement that with a selection of control variables. I won't go very deep into the control variables right now, but more broadly, they may be categorized into 3 vectors. So socio-demographic, economic, and other controls. They're quite standard to models of voting behavior as far as I understand. So that includes sex, age squared, marital status, education, etc. I also include wave fixed effects and country fixed effects to account for different institutional factors and their interaction, which is supposed to capture the supply side effects, so potential endogenous entry in different countries. And of course, you may question the linear probability model. I stick to that to ease coefficient interpretation, but the probit says a very similar story, basically. As for the empirical results, what I would like to share with you. So life satisfaction and populism, here is the central table of my paper. Successive columns, so columns 1, 2, 3, and 4 introduce different kind of control variables. I would see column 3 as the final specification that I would like you to focus on, and these figures that I want to point out. So considering European voters, the baseline category here is 0. So that's being extremely unsatisfied. And one thing that I note is that, first of all the coefficients are negative. So any higher category has potentially decreases an individual's probability of supporting a populist party compared to those who are extremely unsatisfied. Secondly, what I want to note is that these coefficients are potentially increasing in absolute value. And only the higher level coefficients, so those above 4, are statistically significant at the 5 or at the 1% even level. The largest decreases that I would point out are, for example, those at the levels of 8 or 9, which amount to around 4.4 percentage point decreases in probability of supporting populist parties as compared to extremely unsatisfied individuals. Okay, so that would be about it for my message from this. If you want, we can come back to this later on as well and discuss the exact numbers. The first 2 columns basically are, the first column is just the raw correlations without any fixed effects. The second one adds the country and wave fixed effects, and the third one has all the controls. The only thing that changes in the 4th column are that I add some TV controls, which are used in some populist research where you proxy for attention to politics via watching television. And graphically, how may these coefficient dynamics look like? I mean, the standard errors are quite large. This follows a kind of Z pattern. So column 1 is graph A, then column 2 is B, C, and D. And so 2 stories that I would at least interpret from these kind of figures is that, first of all, one may argue that the point estimates are slightly linearly increasing, but also that instead of a linear increase, if you disagree with that, there may be a potential shift in populist support. So around the levels of 5 or 6, what may be more relevant than the actual level of your well-being is whether you pass a certain threshold or not. And I also do that later on in my robustness checks. I binarize the variables of being happy or not being happy, being satisfied or not being satisfied. As for subjective health, so here the baseline category is very good health. And I try to compare, again, the same set of controls, and I try to compare all the individuals across the sample of voters in the ESS. Here there are 5 categories. And again, I see an increase in the probability of supporting populist parties as an individual moves down the categories. So as their health deteriorates or as their subjective health, general health deteriorates. And the largest increase is seen, of course, for those who report to have very bad health. It's around 3.1 percentage points. higher probability in supporting populist parties comparing to those who have very good health. Now, these may seem like not very large effects, but I do want to remind you of the 13% probability of voting populist in the first place, conditional on having voted. And again, another interesting point about this health measure is that some papers do note that European populist parties don't really differ on health policies. So there isn't a strong rationale as to think that, okay, individuals of worse health are only voting for those parties because they might expect some potential health benefits from that. Of course, now in the times of COVID, that might have changed a little bit, but given that we are analyzing pre-COVID data, that's what I would argue. And maybe again, quite briefly, just to mention the coefficient plots from these regressions. As for some caveats of my analysis, so just some points, I guess, to you, because I don't have much experience on this topic. I suppose that one issue with the ESS data is that individuals, first of all, have to answer the survey, but then they have to answer truthfully to the survey. And saying that you voted for a far-right party might be something that someone is ashamed of, let's say, or potentially thinking about it as something not so socially desirable. One paper that uses ESS data as well, the Guizzo et al. Paper that I mentioned earlier, they note around an 80% correlation between ESS and actual voting, but only a 65% correlation for populist voting. Secondly, one point that I want to make here is that I only see well-being at the time of the interview, whereas asking someone about who they voted for in the last general election, let's say it might have been last week, it might have been 4 years ago, and that's something to consider. Then there might also be some reverse causality, and the very reason for that is that an individual may have some benefit from voting for a populist party or for having their party in power. So what came first? Was it the happiness from the election results or the happiness and well-being causing the election results? And then I'll just, I suppose, want to discuss some robustness with you. I mean, I redefined populism and...
Adam, if I may, let's leave the robustness in case these robustness checks come into the conversation.
Yeah, sure, perfect.
Yeah, if you can move towards a conclusion, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, okay, then I could just mention maybe the brief conclusion then that my paper basically builds on some seminal work in populist voting. It follows quite similar methodology to theirs, but it introduces some measures of subjective well-being. I only focus on correlations, so there isn't much causality explored here, and the results suggest that generalized unhappiness and not only dissatisfaction with governments may have contributed to the rise in European populism. And thank you so much. I'm open to any questions and any comments and criticism, really, please. Thank you very much.